Hi guys, thank you for joining our Lean Startup Croatia podcast. Today we are speaking with Eric Ries, the creator of the Lean Startup methodology. So I know that he doesn't need a big introduction, but maybe for some of you who are joining us for the first time, it's good to hear that Eric Ries is an entrepreneur and an author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Lean Startup, which is actually sold in more than 1 million copies and has been translated into more than 30 languages, including Croatian. He's also a creator of the Lean Startup methodology, which is a global movement in business practiced by individuals and companies all around the globe. He's famous as a founder of a number of startups, including IMVU, where he served as a CTO, and he has advised on business and product strategy for startups in venture capital firms and large companies. One of the famous things he did was also his partnership with General Electric, where he partnered to create the FastWorks program. So Eric also served as an entrepreneur in residence at the Harvard Business School in IDEO and Pivotal, and has multiple projects as well. And we are also going to talk about his engagement as a CEO in a long-term stock exchange, which is also something interesting. So, Eric, welcome to our conversation today.
Thank you so much.
So maybe for a short introduction, could you just tell us about the days of your early life and how did you decide to become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so I grew up programming computers. That was my hobby and my addiction as a child. I never thought that I would do it as a business. I always did it because, it's just something that I love to do. And I was, very surprised, to discover later on that it's something you could get paid to do. So I never knew it was any kind of commercial activity until very, very late and very, very late in my youth. And I happened to be in college during the dot-com bubble. So I first got hit by the entrepreneurial bug because it was what everybody was doing, all over the world at that time. And so, I got kind of sucked into it that way. I was not a very good entrepreneur in the early days. So it took me a long time, to realize that. My initial startup in college, failed when the dot-com bubble burst. I didn't know what I didn't know. I thought that being an entrepreneur is just like you see in the movies. You just work hard, get your friends, have a good idea, build some good technology, and everything will be fine. And unfortunately, that's takes a little bit more than that. So eventually, I came out to Silicon Valley and started to work, at more conventional startups where the people who were building them knew a little bit more than I did about what they were doing. But that wasn't the same as having success. I basically found out that a lot of the conventional experts around entrepreneurship also didn't know what they were doing. It's just that they had a lot more money at their disposal. So yeah, my intro to entrepreneurship was very much through failure and a lot of screw up.
Okay, that's usually how it goes, right?
That's right. That definitely goes with the territory.
Yeah,
but not in the movies. Notice how not in the movies. In the movies, it always works out great. So it was quite a shock for me. Not what I expected at all.
Yeah, it's usually that movies are recorded based on trailing data, so they can edit it. Do you remember the moment when you realized, okay, now I quite think I'm doing things right, even though maybe not everything is turning out right, but I think I'm doing it right? Was there a moment you realized it?
I'm not sure I ever felt that way.
Yeah.
I do think it was a big deal to me when we were doing InView. There was a moment when all of a sudden I was having to explain to people why the stuff I was doing worked, rather than explaining why it didn't work. Okay. So like all of a sudden things were going unexpectedly well versus unexpectedly badly. So that was pretty powerful.
It is. Can imagine. Do you have any startup ideas today?
Tons. So many.
Yeah. And could you lead me, how do you think about it? How do you analyze them? What are the first questions you ask yourself?
Sure. So I think that, the hardest part of entrepreneurship is actually having an idea that's in any way worthwhile in the first place. So vision is still the primary requirement of anything that you do in entrepreneurship. And I think we tend to forget that because Lean Startup so much is about validation and about discovering, what's working and what's not working. So it's easy to forget, but it really is still the primary thing. Without a vision, you can't do Lean Startup. You can't do any of the validation and testing type stuff that we like to talk about. So what my experience of it was, like, if someone comes to me with an idea, I tend to try to break it down and say, okay, let's assume that this idea is a good one. What does that mean about the world? What would have to be true for this idea to be a good one? And then from there, we call those the leap of faith assumptions. And then from there, we can break it down and get started and go quickly and do all the stuff that people are accustomed to with Lean Startup. So when I'm thinking about an idea myself, though, you can't take it for granted that someone will have brought you a good idea. You're having a new idea, from scratch. So it requires first to try to experiment and play around in your mind just with the vision of what could this thing be and what's the best possible outcome we could hope for. Because for a lot of startups, it's not. For a lot of startups, the problem isn't so much that they're a bad idea in some objective sense. The problem is that they don't have the possibility for any kind of impact. So it's important to think about not what can go wrong, but what can go right. Does this idea actually have the possibility of turning into something substantial? And if the answer is no, that's okay, but be aware of that. But then there's another trap. It's not just that you think about that that you obviously see how it's going to make a lot of money, because you think about Airbnb or Facebook in the early days. It was kind of easy to see them as a toy, as maybe not necessarily very significant. So you can't fall into that trap. You have to be willing to say, you know what, I'm just going to think about, is this something that, could it solve a problem that is significant to somebody? Or is it the kind of thing that could potentially, grow virally? Or could it be something that's very, very, very sticky for a set of customers? So you have to kind of be willing to think about it in micro. How does it affect individual people? And is there something there? And you can't worry too much about, do you know exactly how it could be big? You just have to think about, does it have the potential for some kind of an impact? And then once you have that scenario in your mind, then from there, you really can figure out, okay, what are the leap of faith assumptions? Okay, how do you build the minimum viable product, and kind of all the Lean Startup stuff that's a little bit more famous.
Yeah, so stick to the vision, right? So it's kind of a definition of a pivot.
Right, exactly. Except that the vision might have multiple different strategies that could get you there.
And do you meet founders often?
Yes, all the time.
You invest in companies or only try to educate?
No, I do both.
Great. And are there any specific, things you search in a company when you are considering an investment? Do you apply some of the things from your career, which are, let's say, tailored in the Lean Startup approach?
Yeah, of course. I always look for founders who think in the way that I'm describing.
Of course.
Because I think those are the ones that are more likely to be successful. So yes, I certainly look for that. But I also do a fair bit of investing just, because I find the idea interesting, or I look forward to learning something that I didn't know before about whatever the topic in question is. So some of the investments I've made, it wasn't so much that I really had some kind of magic insight that I thought it was going to make a lot of money from, but I just thought, hey, this is an interesting company doing something unusual. I'll probably learn something from their experience. So I often invest on that basis too.
Okay. And when considering the Lean Startup and to the moment, who do you think did benefit the most out of it? Are these startups? Are those communities, individuals, large companies, corporates? Who do you think has benefited the most?
I really don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a good question, but I don't know. I think certainly there's a lot of entrepreneurs that have benefited. You know, and I constantly, as I'm traveling around, you know, I meet people who say, "Oh, Lean Startup saved me so much time, or it really helped me with my company." And of course, I'm always so grateful to meet folks like that. But you know, I know a lot of big companies that have benefited. I know governments that have benefited. You know, I think it's hard to say what's the most. You know, and benefit is not only just about people who, you know, who made a lot of money. I meet people sometimes who say, "Hey,
of course not, yeah,
right, Lean Startup helped me get out of a really difficult situation that I was stuck in," or that there's like people who, you know, who have joined the Lean Startup community and the kind of the global movement, have joined the regional Lean Startup groups, and for whom, you know, as an entrepreneur, just being able to do entrepreneurship in the context of a community rather than being alone, you know, to kind of counteract the loneliness of being an entrepreneur. And how do I say this? Like, that people who are trying to get better at entrepreneurship together, often there's something special about that too. So yeah, I don't know. I certainly hope all of those people I've described have benefited from it in some way.
Yeah, of course. And have you considered ever emerging economies? So I've had a personal theory that it's especially useful for startups in emerging economies because there is not so much investment or angel or seed or venture capital investments in these economies, and the markets are usually poor, which means
Right.
that you really have to, you know, try hard, and you really have to find their good niche and good product market fit to find your loyal customers and have a sustainable business.
Right.
Have you had any experiences from emerging economies? And
you know, I get email from people in emerging economies from time to time on this exact topic. So it makes sense to me that it would be true, but I don't feel like I have a lot of firsthand knowledge about emerging economies. So I would be a little bit reluctant to say with certainty, you know, that I know what's going on there.
Yeah, sure.
It certainly stands to reason. It makes sense that it would be for the reasons that you said.
Yeah, great. And do you have like grand vision? You know, what would be the vision for Lean Startup, for example, for next 10 or 20 years?
Whew, that is a hard question, because I didn't know what the last 5 or 10 years are going to look like. I would say there's two things that come up for me when you say that. The first is what I wrote about in the new book is about this kind of common vision that we have for a new kind of company, like truly a company that is driven by innovation and by a desire to unlock the creative potential of all of its employees.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like, that's about really taking seriously the idea that the modern company, a next generation company, is one that thrives by innovation, that thinks long term about its prospects, so that it's kind of willing to make investments for the future, is not resting on its laurels, is agile and nimble in its operations, is not bureaucratic, and therefore can treat all of its employees like they have the opportunity to work in an entrepreneurial way. So that's been a big part of my work. But I feel like there's a complementary or you know, a similar outcome that we need to see happen on the ecosystem level. So we're talking about our world capital markets, our you know, the way that the venture ecosystem works, the way that new companies are built, and the policymakers that shape those systems also have to be transformed in this same way. It's actually why I called the book The Startup Way. It's not just about creating more successful individual companies. It's about a way of thinking that has to permeate every aspect of our society if we want to build a more sustainable, a more long-term, and frankly, a more effective business culture.
Yes, and do you think that the main actors of this change should be the entrepreneurs?
I think they have a very important role to play. If you read the very end of The Startup Way, you know, I kind of had a last few chapters that consider the bigger picture, and I've really tried to emphasize that the problems and the challenges that our society faces in the 21st century, they are not going to be solved through some kind of magic bullet only by entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. Rather, this has got to be a joint effort between entrepreneurs and policymakers and business leaders and nonprofit and activists and politicians. And, you know, this is an all hands on deck, civilization defining moment where we either can renegotiate the social contract like our grandparents did and come out the other side with broadly shared prosperity, or we can fall back into the same darkness that they fought. So I don't mean to be grandiose or bleak about it, but, we are on the precipice. If you read sci-fi novels that have a dystopia in them, we are the antecedent step to many of those dystopias. Like, you could easily imagine a world, straight line world from where we are to where they are. And, will our grandchildren say, gosh, the people of our generation were so short-sighted, so selfish, so unwilling to see the big picture that they just, kept fighting their parochial concerns, and they let the system that their grandparents had built for them burn around them. So I think we have to get really serious about what are we doing, right? What are the challenges and how can they be solved? And are the kind of conventional systems and habits of thought that have gotten us to this place, are they going to get us where we need to go, or is something new required? And it's funny to be talking about something new that is needed to get us back to what our grandparents understood. So it's like there's like a philosophical value system that is old and that we can restore. But then we can't just slavishly do the same things that they did, because the world that they live in is really different from the world that we live in. So what we need to do is kind of identify new methods that are harnessed for the purpose of restoring these old values.
Okay, and at the moment there is a big topic all around us. I didn't mean to mention this in this conversation, but it seems like it's leading us there. But what do you think about this decentralization and all the buzz around decentralization? Is this an important component of this next society you strive to?
Very much so. I'm a big believer in decentralization. I have worked on decentralized systems for a long time. So I've had a real interest in working on stuff like that from a technology point of view, and I've followed blockchain and the distributed autonomous organization and all of these concepts with great interest. I think that if you look at the way that we thought decentralization was going to play out, like in the 90s, and if you read the futurism books of the past, how the early internet pioneers thought the cyber world was going to look like, and the power of anonymous but ubiquitous communication would be to reshape societies, I think we were a little bit naive about some of the darker consequences of those tools. And I'm not just talking about dark nets, and buying and selling drugs and assassinations and the sensationalized downsides that Time Magazine has been writing about for 20 years or longer now.
Yeah,
I think that the more sinister but more important things for us to think through are what happens to the human psychology when we live every day in this absolute overwhelming mass of information and disinformation available 24/7. And so I think that we have to start to think about how do we solve for the psychological problems that are caused by these systems. But rather than demonizing the systems themselves and saying, hey, we should go back to the dark ages when people didn't have instant access to all this information, like that's no good. The idea now that there's like any child born almost in any place in the world today has instantaneous access to, university level educational resources that would have been unthinkable even 20, 30, 40 years ago. We don't want to undo that. But we know that the information access products that we're building, like Facebook and Twitter, are addictive. They have real psychological damage that they do to the people that use them. Well, we're like the tobacco industry, discovering that our products have health consequences. We got to take that seriously. And we know, not to delve into politics or anything, but we know that the traditional methods and checks and balances of democracy depended on certain kinds of information institutions that don't work as well anymore. So we have to solve those problems. We have to take those problems seriously. But I don't think that that's going to be an impossible challenge. I just think it's a real challenge. And the historical analog that occurs to me is, I remember reading, when I learned about the rise of totalitarian government in the early 20th century, people who've studied that carefully talked a lot about how part of the story there is the rise of mass media and the ability to do mass propaganda, not just through print, but through print and through radio, and then later through television. That human society was not yet adapted, had not yet developed antibodies or resistance to propaganda, and so we were vulnerable to it in a way that, after those, after the traumas of those years, we were able to kind of develop, at least in the West, some resistance and some systems and some checks and balances to help prevent that from happening again. I think we're going to look back on this time and say, hey, the rise of social media and some of these internet empowered decentralized systems, that they have a bit of that same problem to them. Like, they're not unsolvable problems. They're not unalloyed evils. It's just that human society is not yet adapted to them. We don't have the antibodies of resistance, and that allows clever, malicious actors to exploit the bugs in our psychology. So I think as an industry, we have to take all this stuff seriously and get to work on it. Or, like I said, dystopia as the second exit from the left.
Yeah, very much. And how do you personally cope with this high inflow of information? Do you have some kind of habits or, things you do?
No, I find it very, very challenging. And in fact, I have had to take Twitter entirely off my phone in order to function. So I did it last year, right after the election. I was just getting so obsessed with politics and the consequences of it, that it was really, my mental health was really deteriorating, and I had to stop. And I went cold turkey and had some time off from it. And then I gradually reintroduced it over the course of 2017. And just over the holidays, I had to go back again and say, you know what, this is really bad for me, and I can't get work done. It's especially bad if you're a creative person, if you have some kind of creative job. So like as a writer, as someone who's like, it's a very vulnerable thing to write things, put them out in the world. I write these books, people criticize them. The human psychology is such that, one negative comment, outweighs 100 positive comments. So when people write nasty reviews or they tweet you really unthinkably mean things, it affects you. And so I've had to kind of pull back once again from that in order to function. The flip side of it is I also realized how many hours a day I was spending on it. I mean, each time I take these services off my phone and I replace them with novels, I just go to the Kindle app instead of the Twitter app. I've read like 15 books, in the time that I would have just been checking Twitter. It's really astonishing. So I think that, like, we have to build better clients for navigating these flows. Like, I think there's got to be a way. Like, when I was on Twitter, I was extremely well informed about current events, about the technology industry, I was the first to know about a lot of things that were important to me. And now without that, I'm relatively ignorant. But on the other hand, I can function again. So, we got to find a way to get the positive to these systems without the negative.
Yeah, that's correct. But you just said that for a creative person, this is quite alien. You like when you have this creative pause, what you do, you just switch your phone, you turn on Instagram or Twitter, and you just scroll, and then you cut yourself after 5 minutes doing that instead of writing another sentence or something. So yeah, that's a problem. And
yeah, that's certainly true and so frustrating.
Yeah, that's what I did as well. So I removed all the apps from the phone. When talking about this third wave or this another world which we are expecting to emerge in several years or a decade, you as a father, what kind of advice would you give to your children regarding education? What kind of education to pursue, and how would you point them?
Ooh, that's a very profound question. My children are quite young, so we're not yet able to have these kinds of conversations. So this is a question for the future for me about how I would want them to pursue education, and what can I do really but to say, here's what worked for me. I was very lucky to have parents that cared a lot about education, that insisted that I always have the best education that they could find, and that were really interested in diversifying my interests away from just what I was good at or what I found easy. So they pushed me to have a broad, wide-ranging liberal arts education, but they never prevented me from being able to go deep into the topics that I cared a lot about. So that really is the combination that I cherish. The ability to go very, very broad, to study not just computer science or math, but the sciences, the arts, the humanities, philosophy, to try to think about the structure of things in a deep way, to understand how the world works from first principles, to understand history and the human condition. Those are very important topics for me personally. So I'm very grateful to have had that, had that exposure from a young age and be able to continue that as an educational program. What I hope in the next century is that our educational institutions will themselves become more humane. So one of the challenges for me is I always found it hard to balance the kind of beauty and compassion and really profound insight of these great works of literature and history, and the kind of like the fidelity to big ideas that were embedded into the curriculum of these institutions, with the kind of very cold and cruel systems that they would run themselves. So I hope that for my kids, we'll be able to find educational institutions that have the rigor and the the history and the critical thinking that I cherish, without the cruelty and the bullying and the kind of inattention to the emotional and spiritual side of life. That's also super important. So that's what I hope for them.
Yeah, I hope so. So when let's say if we connect education and we think about Lean Startup again, and it's all about learning about and from your customers, right? And
yes.
If we apply this idea of Lean Startup to human education per se, and,
yes.
Is this efficient today at this current stage when you are, for example, you go to some kind of college, or you have a high school and then you go to the college and then you study something for 3 or 4 years? Is this really necessary, so much time to invest in something that might turn out is not actually your interest? And is it possible to have this more efficient, maybe more Lean Startup?
Yeah, every form of education and research has a fundamental tension or duality in it, which is that on the one hand, research, science, inquiry, free inquiry can prove enormously valuable and have huge real world impact. And it's also highly unpredictable. And so when we try to make education more efficient, sometimes trying to make research more efficient by directing it only to things which are useful, we have the problem that if you could tell in advance which things were useful, you wouldn't necessarily have to do the research in the first place. So I think the same rule applies to education, which is that we have to be willing to entertain a combination of breadth and depth type strategies. And even for me, as I was just lauding the incredible diversity of educational experiences that I had when I was growing up, at the same time, when I was in those institutions, I often found the kind of theoretical, academic, abstract only learning very frustrating, and I constantly had real world application type projects on the side. That's ultimately what drew me into entrepreneurship as we started the interview you're talking about. So I just think it's a matter of balancing. We have to try to find a mix of studying things just for their own sake and just trying to see what happens, while also learning how to put those ideas into practice to kind of see what it's like, to try them on, to feel them out. And at the time, if I would have said it as a young person that the way to do that is through technology. I would say, okay, the real world applications that matter are the building of real world technological solutions, for real people. And everything else is kind of abstract. But now I understand that a lot of other people who went through school, just like I did, they were doing the same thing, but in other domains. So I think about, there was a lot of activists on campus, or people who would, spend their time tutoring, or investing in the community, or helping people, defendants pro bono, or engaging in architecture projects, and all of those campus activities, not to mention all the ones that are really about the arts. They're all ways of kind of trying on different ways of living, different ideas about what's important. And so I think that combination of experimentation with broad inquiry is kind of something I think unique to the educational process. But I don't know, maybe we should all do that in our lives. And heck, maybe that would even be a better balance to have in our companies too, to not only be concerned with validation all the time, but also, free inquiry into the next new idea.
Yeah, because validation is quite stressful.
So that's for sure. Definitely not something you can work on 24/7. It's impossible.
Yeah. You were mentioning the transformation that is needed on the capital markets, right?
Yes.
When speaking about the things which are
Of course.
expecting, and you did something in this area, or you are doing at the moment, right? So
Yes,
it's
that's correct.
called the long-term stock exchange. So could you just give us a short intro? What is the long-term stock exchange, and what was your motivation to initiate such a project or a company?
Sure. I'll answer the second question first, because by really answering the second question, we'll actually answer the first on the way. So the way that I think about it is, I was writing the Lean Startup, many years ago, and I was studying Toyota and the other great companies that I thought were worthy of emulation. Not just Toyota, but Jeff Bezos, at Amazon. The people who study these things say that having a philosophy of long-term thinking is one of the primary determinants of your ability to build a great company like that. So I was like, this is great. Long-termism is critical to the Lean Startup, because the rapid experimentation only makes sense in the context of a long-term vision. So that's great news. Basically, once I was talking to people about Lean Startup and kind of out in the world evangelizing for it, I noticed this really strange kind of problem, which is that too many of the people that I was advising were stuck in a venture ecosystem where their goal was to build a company that they would take public, or that they would sell to a public company in a so-called exit. Which at first, I didn't think that was too bad of a problem, but more and more I kept getting the question from people, wait a minute, if long-term thinking is such an essential part of creating long-term success, why exactly am I taking my baby, this precious company that I'm building, why am I taking it into the ultimate short-term arena of the way our public markets and the quarterly pressure and the guidance and the beat and raise game? Like, how are these two things compatible? And so that was the start for me of kind of to write about saying, I think we have ecosystem level problems that require some attention beyond just how we build companies themselves. And so that was the start of my interest in it. And I said, hey, we really ought to find a way to bring long-term investors and long-term oriented companies together for mutual benefit. Because it strikes me that if companies are distracted from their job of fundamental value creation, then they're not worth as much money. And then if they're not worth as much money, they're not worth as much for investors. And so what we need to do is create a new institution that can help build a new bargain between investors and companies, where both would be incentivized to think for the long term, and therefore both would be more valuable. And that's how it started. And that's what it is. It's called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, or LTSE.
Yes. And what is the present stage of the long-term stock exchange?
We are, we've raised money. We have a team of, maybe 15 full-time people. Mm-hmm. And we are in the process of applying to the SEC here in the U.S. For permission to operate a new stock exchange. So that's a lengthy regulatory process, as you can imagine, but we're in the middle of it.
So a company would have an option to list on your exchange, or, for example, the NASDAQ, or they could do both?
Yes, they could choose either or both.
Okay. And this is like the first time somebody proposed this another model of the exchange, or there are some examples from the past? I'm not familiar.
No, there are other stock exchanges, and obviously there are many stock exchanges in the world. Yeah. But in the U.S., most of the exchanges are really primarily about trading, so new ways of doing stock trading. This is the first one in a long time where the purpose of the exchange is to create a new listings environment, a new corporate governance paradigm.
Good. And there is a connection between the long-term stock exchange and investors who want to have the long-term vision and to have building products for their customers, not fulfilling like quarterly targets, and the Lean Startup, right?
Certainly. I mean, that's certainly very connected. And if you read the standards of the exchange carefully, the listing standards, mm-hmm. you'll see the Lean Startup influence there for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're complementary. They're complementary initiatives because in order to do a management transformation, in order to do the kind of management practices we recommend from Lean Startup, that requires that we have incentives and investor relations that support that.
So in the model of the long-term stock exchange, actually your vote would be more weighted as longer you are invested in, right?
Yes, that's right.
So it doesn't matter how much money you invested. The matter is how long, right?
Yeah, it would be a combination of both factors since
Combination.
the length of holding is on a per share basis. But yeah.
Okay, great. Well, wish you a lot of success with this project. Hope you have many companies listed. It might be a game changer as well.
So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Maybe we can talk about the Startup Way book a little bit. There was one of the principles from the Lean Startup, which was kind of underrated by the readers, and it's the innovation accounting, I would say. Well, this is somehow, let's say, you are paraphrasing this in the Startup Way. And how did you actually decide to have a whole new chapter about innovation accounting in the book? And why do you think it's so important in the corporate environment?
So I think innovation accounting is just a difficult topic. It's one that is challenging mathematically, requires a certain rigor of thinking, and it's therefore one of the more misunderstood ones. So that's why I wanted to give it its own chapter in the Startup Way. And it's one where I think the state of the art has advanced a lot since the Lean Startup was published in 2011. So I think we've made a lot of progress as a movement sorting these ideas out. Although I think we're by no means done. I think we have made progress. It's important because in order for us to demonstrate that a startup is learning something valuable, we have to be able to quantify what that learning is worth. And we have to be wary of a false precision. Of course, we can't say down to the dollars and cents, but we can show that we are directionally making progress in a startup. And it's kind of the difference between a startup and some kind of abstract research initiative is that the learning that we're doing, what we call validated learning in Lean Startup, is designed to be commercially valuable, to have impact. It's not just learning for its own sake. So we have to be able to demonstrate that impact is increasing or improving over time. And that's why we look at metrics, not just the gross numbers, but also on a per customer basis, on a per user basis, on a per client basis. To say, hey, you know what? Customers are more satisfied with this iteration than the one before. They're more likely to buy than this iteration than the one before. They're more likely to change their behavior as a result of this iteration than the one before. So that's the way that we think about doing an accounting that's just as rigorous as cost accounting and maybe just as boring for people to study, but it is every bit as important to do so.
So, what do you think? What should your next book be about? Is there any idea?
No, I can't even. I just wrote this one, so I can't even really think about that. I hope. Look. I'm lucky. I feel very fortunate, very blessed in my life that the years after Lean Startup was published, I was able to do. I was invited to do a lot of very interesting kinds of work that then became interesting stories to tell in the next book. So, God willing, I'll have the chance to do some more interesting things in the next few years, and then we'll see where it goes. Or maybe I'll finally have the chance to retire to my much more quiet engineering type life where I don't have to be in public quite so often, and I can wind up like Luke Skywalker in the new movie, living in peace and quiet.
Yeah, that would be cool. So, two quick questions for the
end.
If you would have to pick one industry, one emerging technology, you would invest your next 5 years of time in, which one you think it should be?
Well, if I was really truly faced with that question, I would pick something that no one's ever heard of yet.
Yeah.
I think the obvious choices are probably machine learning, biohacking, some kind of garage bioscience, genomics thing, I think there's a lot going on, broadly speaking, in the finance and fintech space. Not just crypto, but beyond that. So I feel like there's kind of very obvious choices, but because they're obvious choices, maybe there's a lot going on there. if I had to pick one of those, I would probably do something in machine learning. I just think that, that the most broadly applicable, most disruptive thing ultimately is going to have machine learning as kind of a core competency. And so there's kind of opportunities to build infrastructure layers for that new world. But that, that requires some pretty deep expertise. But yeah, if it was really me, if I was really saying, hey, I'm in like in a university right now trying to figure out what's next, I wouldn't be thinking about the things that someone like me thinks are obvious. I'd be trying to ask myself, what are the next, revolutionary technologies that are just now starting to become viable and therefore are just now could possibly become the basis for a new revolution.
Mm-hmm. Good, thanks. And the next question is about the books. So besides the Lean Startup, which book would you recommend to startup founders? Is there
I wouldn't read too many books. Seriously. I mean, I write books because I think they're valuable, and a little bit of theory goes a long way. So of course, there are great books about entrepreneurship that you can read. You can read Steve Blank's books. You can read Brad Feld's books. Even 0 to 1 or Ben Horowitz's book. Like there's quality books about entrepreneurship that are being written. But don't go read 50 books about entrepreneurship. I'd rather you do your actual business. Or if you're not yet sure what you want to do, then read fiction, read nonfiction, read history for sources of inspiration. In the technology business, the easiest thing to do is read science fiction, because then it's just like free product ideas, on every page practically. But do things that expand your scope of what's possible. Don't just be reading business literature.
Yeah, that's a good advice. Thank you. So we'll be wrapping up in a minute. Are there any final thoughts maybe you would like to share?
Well, just that, if anyone's listening to this and finds these ideas interesting, get started. While inspiration is a rare commodity and it's highly perishable. So if you feel through this or through any other method, if any day you wake up one morning and you feel particularly inspired, get started. You don't have to wait for some magic moment to be qualified. You don't have to complete another training. You don't have to get some additional resource. You can start right now. So just start.
Great. You will be joining some of the events in Europe in following months, right?
Yes, that's right. I'm coming out for the Nordic Business Forum, I think in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Towards the end of January. I'll be in Oslo and in Stockholm. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and you have on 21st of March, there's going to be a Lean Startup conference in Amsterdam, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so that's also an opportunity to have a Lean Startup community in Europe to join everybody there.
Yes, please do. Please come on out.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, and listen, and in most places, I think in many of the cities in Europe, and certainly around the world, there are Lean Startup meetups and Lean Startup groups that are still going and thriving. So join your local community, and don't forget that, doing entrepreneurship with other people and kind of expanding the state of the art, that's a very valuable thing to do in and of itself.
Great, Eric. Well, thank you very much for joining our conversation today, and wish you a lot of luck in all the projects you're running, and hope to meet you at some of the future events in Europe or the States. Yeah.
I look forward to it. All right, take care.
Take care.